Good evening. A very warm welcome to you all and to the first lecture of our 2020 season, and indeed our first landmark lecture of the season. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. Well, that's very kind of you, and perhaps undeserved, but thank you. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. We're also very pleased to present this series of landmark lectures in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I would like to express our appreciation for their help and publicity support. For those of you who are less familiar with the General Society, and I'm going to ask, I hope those of you who have been asked this question many times, how many of you here this evening is this your very first visit? Okay, well, a warm welcome to you and a very warm welcome to those who are returning for our lectures. The General Society was founded in 1785, 235 years ago. Our mission is to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Collection, which you are welcome to visit after tonight's talk, our library, of course, of which you're in. And I have to mention something. This year, our library is going to be celebrating 200 years. It was founded in 1820, so we're very, very proud of that fact. And finally, our lecture series, which is also not quite at 200 years, but is getting close. So we have a distinguished tradition of public lectures. And this evening we are going to have a very special lecture. And I just want to mention at this point, I will also mention at the end, that this wonderful book, Grand Central Terminal, 100 Years of a New York Landmark, will be for sale and will be signed by our distinguished speaker tonight. And to introduce our speaker this evening, I'm very pleased to introduce the curator for the series, Lisa Easton, a partner in the New York City-based architecture and historic preservation firm, Easton Architects. I would also like to express our gratitude to Lisa for the wonderful job she has done in not only curating this series, but for her curation of the past 7 series. So thank you, Lisa. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Lisa Easton.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everyone. Preservation provides us with tangible objects that provide identity, memory, and continuity to ourselves, our communities, and our personal history. It helps root us in our heritage. It develops unity and provides a spirit that helps define a neighborhood, a community, and a city. It establishes a timeline, and it provides answers to the questions of time and place, rise and fall, riches and neglect. Preservation is not about being nostalgic. It's about living in a better present, that we are part of a broader reach that connects eras, creates continuity, and embraces a more cumulative whole. And this is as important as the physical landmarks that represent our past and provide the foundation for our future. I'm honored to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen 2020 Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. And when asked to curate the 4-part lecture series on landmarks, I wanted to bring together a group of individuals whose experience captures the essence of preserving our treasured landmarks, from technology and materials and methodology to advocacy and historic research. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce our first lecturer in this year's series, Tony Robbins. Tony is a historian and writer who specializes in the architecture of New York City. He holds a master's degree in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and was the winner of a 1997 Rome Prize. During a 20-year-long career at the New York Landmarks Preservation Commission, he served as Deputy Director of Research and Director of Survey. He has written for the New York Times, New York Magazine, Preservation, and Architectural Record, among many others. He teaches at Columbia University and New York University, lectures nationally and internationally, and has led many walking tours of New York City. He is the author of architectural-related books on the New York City subway, the original World Trade Center. His recent book, New York Art Deco, A Guide to Gotham's Jazz Age Architecture, won a 2017 New York City Book Award from the New York Society Library. And tonight his lecture is inspired by his recent book, Grand Central Terminal, 100 Years of a New York Landmark. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Tony Robbins.
Okay. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I feel as though I was watching my life pass before my eyes. But when you started out by talking about memory and the place of buildings in the city, I can't think of and landmarks. I can't think of a better example than Grand Central Terminal. This is just one of the most striking buildings. It's both because of its architecture, its place in the life of the city as a transportation hub, and also its physical location. As you see on the screen, it's unlike most buildings in Manhattan. It blocks traffic. It's right there. It cuts off Park Avenue right at 42nd Street, and there's no Park Avenue. There's a elevated roadway that goes around the building, but Park Avenue doesn't come back until really 46th Street. So it's 4 blocks, which is remarkable. New Yorkers don't generally know what to do with buildings that block traffic. But if this seems to be blocking traffic a great deal, what must it have been like back when the first Grand Central opened in 1871, and we're looking at the train yard on the right. We're standing with our back to the station looking north, but on the left we're looking at the entrance to the head house, to the train house where the trains come in. This train yard ran from 42nd Street up to 50th Street. Park Avenue just didn't exist there. It was this vast 16 square block site smack in the heart of what is now Midtown Manhattan. And if you look carefully, you will on the right, you can see those rather unsteady-looking metal bridges that walk across it. That was, I guess, the only way you could get across from the west to the east, unless you walked all the way around. And you wonder, how is that possible that New York would let this happen in the middle of Midtown Manhattan? And the answer is very simple. Back in 1871, this was not the middle of Manhattan. This was way, way to the north. I know some of you are going to know this, but just to quickly recap. New York, which was Manhattan until the end of the 19th century, a little piece of the Bronx tucked on, is not like other cities in so many ways, but especially in terms of its geography. It's a long, narrow island with important rivers on either side that didn't get physical connections to the other side until late in the 19th century. The Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, and then the tracks to Penn Station around the turn of the century. And the original settlement was down at the tip of the island. So when it came time to grow, the city moved northward up the island. And if you look carefully, the map on the right is 1860. You'll see that it's quite densely developed in the southern tip there, but above 14th Street, not so much. And by the time you get up to 42nd Street, you're really in the very outskirts of the city. So what's Grand Central doing there? And the answer is it's doing the same thing that Kennedy Airport is doing out in Queens. It's being away from the center of town. Trains, remember, were choo-choo trains. They belched smoke and ash. Nobody wanted them in their backyard. And the city passed a series of regulations saying that steam engines could not come to certain parts of Manhattan. Originally, there were depots on Chambers Street. Then they were pushed north. Finally, they said, okay, no steam engines south of 42nd Street. That'll keep them out of our hair forever. And that was the plan. The person who made Grand Central, the original Grand Central, happen is Commodore Vanderbilt, whom you see there on the screen. Vanderbilt was from a family who did shipping. Actually, he got his start in his family's business, which was basically a little ferry boat that went from Staten Island to Manhattan Island. He dropped out of school to help his dad run it. From that, he built an enormous shipping empire, but on the water, because on the water was the only way to travel. Before the trains changed everything, the way you traveled around New York State really was, you could do it on horseback, of course, but it was waterways, canals, a lengthy canal system. The Erie Canal is probably the most famous. Trains started in the 1830s, roughly, and before long, the canal boats had become pleasure boats rather than actual useful ways to travel, because the trains were simply much, much faster. The map you see on the right shows a lot of the different canal routes that were then supplanted by the trains. So the first the first version of Grand Central, which was called Grand Central Depot, was built in 1869 to 71. It was at 42nd Street, much smaller than the one that we have now. It united three different lines, the New York and Harlem, the New York and Hudson, and the New York and New Haven, the same lines that you'll see if you go to buy a ticket at Grand Central today. That was a lot of trains. They came in from different parts of the world. They ended up on 42nd Street. Therefore, they needed a large train shed. The train shed that went up for the first version of the station, which you see there on the right, was the second largest in the world when it opened in 1871. The largest had opened just 2 years earlier, St. Pancras Station in London in 1869. You can see that they're very similar in their layout. It's a huge open space, and this was considered an extraordinary engineering marvel. When it opened, the newspapers kept telling people, you know what, if you haven't seen this going up, you must go down to the site and watch. On the slide on the left, what you're looking at is it's like an enormous bridge on wheels that goes back and forth, from which the ironwork was then raised, and it was quite the thing to see. On the right, as the result, there is the train shed. Yes, it was called a triumph of mechanical ingenuity. There was nothing like this in New York, or really anywhere else in the country at the time. The ironwork was done by D.D. Badger, whom you might recognize as one of the 5 big iron foundries in the 19th century that did cast iron buildings in Soho, Tribeca, and elsewhere. And they also did a lot of train work. So up in the upper left-hand corner, there is a detail of what their train shed looked like, and it's really quite lovely. There's another piece of their train work, a bridge. This is Victorian times. This was just the train shed. Who's going to see this? The mechanics working under the trains aren't even going to look up and notice it. But it was how things were done. It had to look beautiful. That's just how things happened. And the detail is actually quite wonderful. All right, the architect of the first station was John B. Snook. Snook was the architect for what was then one of the biggest buildings in New York, Alexander Stewart's Marble Palace. This was still survives. It's bigger. It's much larger. It's had a few extra stories, and it's now an entire block front. But it's down on Chambers and Broadway. And when it opened, it was really the world's first department store. A marble building. It was called his Marble Palace. And there was really nothing to compete with it besides City Hall. So he was a logical person to ask to come in and tackle this enormous new train terminal that Vanderbilt wanted built. It's the 19th century, and as we know, in the 19th century, New York architects tended to design buildings with one eye looking over their left shoulder at Europe, by which they really meant England or France, to a lesser extent Spain, Italy, and Germany. In this case, it was France. There is the first Grand Central on the right, and there is its model, the new Louvre, on the left, which was about 12 or 13 years old by the time Grand Central went up. The new Louvre, that's the wall you see if you visit the Louvre and you're standing near I.M. Pei's pyramid in the center. That's one of 3 sides that look rather like that. Much larger than the first Grand Central, but it's done on the typical French way of designing buildings. It's the pavilion model. There's a section of the center that juts out and rises higher than the rest, and then there are slightly smaller pavilions at either end, and that organizes the building. That's why the Louvre looks that way. That's how the French were designing their buildings in the 19th century. John Snook's building looks the way it does because it's trying to look like the Louvre in Paris. But it also works really well to have 3 towers because, remember, there were 3 train lines, the New York and Harlem, the New York and Hudson, and the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. So each, you can't really see it, but there is lettering on each of those towers, each one related to one of those lines. They had separate facilities, separate luggage facilities, separate waiting rooms. They really were 3 very separate lines operating under one roof. So it opened in 1871, and how did you get downtown? Again, it's not that different from Kennedy. Kennedy, you get out and you take a cab, or you take the air train. Here you connect to horse cars, which would then take you downtown. Trains weren't allowed downtown, but the horse cars, of course, could go. It was a big terminal, not nearly as big as the current one. It runs from, well, 4th Avenue would be Park Avenue, runs from Park Avenue to Vanderbilt Avenue. That's roughly half the width of the current building. It was still just enormous. But train travel doubled and doubled again. And soon there wasn't enough room, there weren't enough tracks. So an annex was built in 1885. On the left, on the right, pardon me, you're looking at the interior, standing in the annex, looking at the original. Up those steps would be the original. It added, I think, half a dozen or a dozen new tracks. What you're seeing on the left, you can't really see the annex because it's hidden by the spur from the 3rd Avenue elevated train. That 3rd Avenue is another block or so over. But once Grand Central was up, it was important to have a connection, and that was the spur that just got off 3rd Avenue, cut west, and just pulled up in front of the building. And that was fine for a few more years, but train travel kept doubling and doubling again. So it became necessary to rebuild Grand Central, not to replace it. This is an extension of the first building. It looks completely different because it's been designed to be completely different, but a lot of the original walls are in there somewhere. It's just much bigger and much taller. By the way, train traffic never stopped during the reconstruction. They were going day and night while the trains came in and out. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. Bradford Lee Gilbert was the architect, and he did a beautiful job. It still has a French look, more of a neoclassical look than the first one, with several enormous towers, continuing that idea of the towers on the building. The inside, he had some very interesting plans for the waiting room on the left. That was what he wanted to do, this great big arched space. And that was apparently too radical. It took some time to get it going. By the time building was ready, they said, man, we're not going to do that. We'll do something that we're used to. And so you got the space on the right, which looks rather like the waiting room of the building as we have it today. But as you can see, they've given up on having 3 different waiting rooms for the 3 different lines. It's now one great big waiting room for everybody who's coming to Grand Central. The tracks originally were at grade. Remember, theoretically, you're way up, away from the center of town, so the tracks went straight up 4th Avenue, Park Avenue. But almost immediately there were complaints that it was dangerous, it was nasty conditions, and really Vanderbilt needed to do something about it. So he did. He sunk the tracks underground, as you can see there on the right. And already, new buildings were going up because the city was gradually moving north and development was happening around the tracks. And, oops, sorry, there we go. And now you see what the solution was: put it underground and have landscaped areas around the ventilating shafts. You have to have ventilating shafts because they were belching smoke and ash. What you're looking at on the right, there are 2 tracks that you can see. Behind the wall on the left is one more track. Behind the wall on the right is another track. So there were really 4 tracks from 50th Street going north and then separating to go on their different ways. These were called beam tunnels. If you look carefully at the image on the left, you will see that there is a beam cutting across the center of the opening. Today's Park Avenue with its landscaped malls is really the descendant of this original plan. Now, it was... Yes, there was ventilation, but it was really pretty miserable. Trains left Grand Central. It was a 7-minute ride to 97th Street, where the trains come up today onto the viaduct that rises above ground at 97th Street. And yes, there was ventilation, but there were also tunnel parts, and apparently it was hell to be on a train in those 7 minutes. The temperature shot up to 100 degrees. The cars filled with smoke. It was really pretty awful. This cartoon appeared on the left at the Grand Central Station she, "Jim and I hope you'll have a pleasant journey, Mother." Jim, "Yes. Just think, in 7 minutes from now, you'll either be happily through the tunnel or else lying somewhere mangled beyond recognition." And while that may have been funny when it appeared, unfortunately, that is in fact what happened. What you're seeing on the right was the collision that happened in 1902. Remember, there are 3 different trains that are using the tracks. And there are all these tunnels, and there's all this smoke. So one train, I think coming from New Haven, came down Park Avenue, saw a red signal, and stopped. And a train coming from one of the other 2 routes, apparently because the smoke was so thick, didn't see the red signal and didn't see the train, and plowed into it. And more than 20 people died, and many more were injured. It was a catastrophe. New York State Legislature passed a law saying that in the next, I think it was 8 years, the New York Central had to do something about this. The New York Central figured out that if they didn't do something about it really fast, they'd be out of business. So what to do? And the answer came from this man, William Wilgus, really a genius of an engineer. Wilgus looked at the situation. He said, "It's all about the smoke, isn't it? You know how we can get rid of the smoke? We can electrify the system. That's happening all around us. The new Penn Central is going to be electric, at least as it comes into the city. The subway's about to open. It's going to be electrically run. Over in Paris, the Gare d'Orsay, a new train station, the train service was electrified just for a few miles in and out, but enough to keep the smoke away from the problem. If we electrify at least a part of the route, we can cover those tunnels over completely. There will no longer be a problem with smoke. There will be no further accidents. Now, we'll also, let's see. Here he is. He actually developed a version of the third rail. Wilgus's third rail is there on the left to make this possible. And he had the honor of being the engineer for the first ceremonial run from High Bridge to Grand Central, which happened on September 30, 1906. And those are all engineers who've apparently come from all over the country to witness this marvel. And he got to drive it in to Grand Central. It must have been the finest day in his life. So with all of this train traffic, is that, it's going to expand. We're going to have much more traffic. We're going to have to build a new terminal. And while we're at it, if we can, it's not just the tracks we can put underground. We could put the entire train shed and train yard underground, right? All that huge area that runs from 42nd to 50th Street that was so open, we can put all of that underground. And if we can put one train shed and train yard underground, we can put 2 train sheds and train yards underground. We'll have an upper one for local commuter trains and a lower one for express long-distance trains. This will really increase our potential for service. We'll have to build an entire new terminal to handle all the traffic. This is going to cost a lot of money. How are we going to pay for it? Remember, this wasn't done by government. This was done by a private company. Well, if we've covered over all of that land, suddenly, what have we got? We have 16 blocks of pristine New York real estate. We can rent it, we can build on it, we can lease it out. It's worth millions. And that real estate development will pay for everything. And in fact, apparently it was Wilgus who popularized the expression air rights, talking about the right to build above the train tracks. So what you're looking at is the way 2 levels work. On the upper illustration, there you can see that it says express level and then suburban level. Notice it's from 45th Street to 48th Street. That's quite large. And then there's the train yard as seen stretching in. The trains come in, there are 4 tracks, remember, coming down Park Avenue, in this case from the right, and then you get to about 46th Street, and then the train yard stretches out. And so that is what they did. There's the express level, there's the suburban level. You'll notice that they each seem to have a looping track that runs around the side. The original trains came down Park Avenue, belching smoke and ash. And the company did not want the trains to go into the train shed, belching smoke and ash, because it would make it uncomfortable and dirty. So they didn't. How did you get a train into the train shed without belching smoke and ash from the locomotive? By performing what was called the flying switch. So imagine you're the conductor of a train. You're coming down Park Avenue. Trip's almost over. You see the train shed ahead of you. As you approach it, you detach the locomotive from the rest of the train, and it turns off to the side, never goes into the train shed. But by sheer dint of the momentum, the train continues down the track into the shed, into the train shed, and the engineer gradually applies the brake just enough to slow it down and bringing it to a stop where it belongs to. Apparently never had an accident. Just amazing. But, that was a really complicated thing to do. So Wilgus said, this is a terminal. We're not going any further. Trains have to turn around and go back. So we're going to have a loop that runs all the way around. In fact, it passes under the oyster bar. So our trains can go that and turn around and come back out. Much simpler than trying to say back out, although these days that is what they do. All right, the new terminal was a very complicated place. And this cutaway shows just how complicated it was. On the left, you can see the double layer of train yard and train shed with the street above. In the center, there is the Grand Concourse, even with the sky mural being shown. On the right, what have we got? Well, there's the 42nd Street shuttle of the subway, because the subway's now been built, and the number 7 train, what we call today the 7 train, that's gone on its way out to Queens. And then a lot of pedestrians. This is an incredibly complicated nexus of transportation, cars, pedestrians, and trains, and really handled brilliantly by this design by Mr. Wilgus. All right. Well, now that we're going to do that, we actually have to excavate a new train yard and make this happen. And again, train service never stopped. They did it a third at a time. They kept the trains on 2/3 while 1/3 was excavated, and then when that one was ready, that one went into use, and the middle one, and then the far one. You're looking at some of the original conditions on the left, and then here's some people actually doing the construction work as they dig this basically this enormous tunnel. The only thing that was comparable to this construction at the time was apparently somewhat larger, of course, was the Panama Canal. The two of them seem to have the record at that moment for doing these enormous construction projects involving this kind of excavation. And the result is what you see, and it just goes on for blocks and blocks and blocks of all these underground tracks. All right, now, remember, there was no Park Avenue, so having dug out and lowered the train yard and the train shed, Park Avenue had to be created. On the left is a drawing, but on the right is a photograph. And you can see in both of them that the streets have been put through. There is Park Avenue. Left and right, you can see the streets, but the buildings haven't yet gone up. So you look down, and on the left in the drawing, you see the tracks. On the right, you look down and you see the tops of the protections of the protecting elements of the siding. That's what's there. Then buildings will go up. Now, having figured out that we're going to do this, that takes care of the engineering. What about designing the building? And as so often happens with a project of this importance and size, New York Central said we're going to have a competition. And 4 firms were invited to send in proposals. 2 of them, their proposals don't survive. Daniel Burnham, wouldn't it be wonderful to see what he had in mind? But his proposal doesn't survive. The second, Samuel Huckle Jr., no one seems to have heard of, and his work doesn't survive either. The ones that do are the other 2 firms who were invited, McKinmead and White and Reid Stem. McKinmead and White and Daniel Burnham at that time were both just signing on to do train stations for the Pennsylvania Railroad. McKinmead and White for Penn Station in New York, Daniel Burnham for Union Station in D.C. They actually met in New York to talk about what they might do for Grand Central, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that lunch that they had. Reid and Stem did the proposal on the right. So McKinmead and White, major firm, probably the most famous firm of New York at the time. Reid and Stem, not so much. Who were Reid and Stem? They were really specialists in rail travel. They did railroad work, railroad stations. And they got the job. Now, one of them, I forget which one, was a brother-in-law of Wilgus. So that does sound a little bit like nepotism, but it was really more an issue of Wilgus saying, I know how to work with these people. They'll understand what I'm doing, and I need them. So Reid and Stem got the job. McKinmead and White's plan over there on the left includes that enormous tower that looks a little bit like the Campanile in St. Mark's in Venice. Had that been built, it was 100 stories. It would have been the tallest building in the world when it went up. It was a very grand plan. It didn't happen. Reid and Stem also had a tower, but it was more of an 18 to 20-story tower above the terminal, and in the end, that didn't get built either. But Reid and Stem also had grand ideas. For the north side of the terminal, they imagined this huge neoclassical complex with statues and reflecting pools going up Park Avenue from 46th Street to 50th Street. And I don't know for a fact, but it looks awfully like some of the things that were happening in Chicago back in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition, which you see down there in the lower half. That was their thought. All right, so Reid and Stem got the job. So imagine that you're Mr. Reid or you're Mr. Stem. The phone rings. I don't know if they had a phone, but they might have. And it's William K. Vanderbilt, who's now the head of the board. And he said, well, Mr. Reid, Mr. Stem, congratulations, you've won the competition. Oh, well, Mr. Vanderbilt, that's wonderful. That's a great honor. Thank you. And Vanderbilt said, yes, of course it's a great honor, and you'll be working with the firm of Warren and Wetmore. I'm sorry? Didn't you say that we'd won the competition? Yes, you won the competition, and you're going to be working with the firm of Warren and Wetmore. What this was about was a different kind of competition. Because Pennsylvania Railroad was building its new station over on 7th Avenue. McKimmitt and White were the designers. You always have to stop and look at this thing and think, good heavens, did that really exist here? And did we really destroy it? And the answer to both questions is yes. And Vanderbilt looked at this and said, Reid and Stem may know trains, but they can't do this. Their drawings really didn't make a lot of sense. I have to compete with that. So he brought in Warren and Wetmore, who were on the same level architecturally as McKimmitt and White. They'd studied in Paris. They grand architectural designs. Warren was also a distant cousin of Vanderbilt. Of course, Reid and Stem couldn't complain about that since they were related to the engineer. But more to the point, Warren was also someone who ran in Vanderbilt's social circles. So they did it. And so you had three parties really doing the new terminal: the engineer, William Wilgus, and then these two firms, Reid and Stem, and Warren and Wetmore. And apparently the way it worked is that Warren and Wetmore handled things like circulation and planning, which is what they did. And, Reid and Stem did that, and Warren and Wetmore did the design because that's what they did. And it was not pleasant, and the two architectural firms ended up in a nasty lawsuit, and Wilgus resigned halfway through because he couldn't take it. But in the end, they all did what they did best, and that's why the terminal is as wonderful as it is. So there is Whitney Warren, there's Charles Wetmore. You can see that these are the kinds of people who might be in the same social circle as Mr. Vanderbilt. Warren studied in Paris, as most architects who could swing it did in the late 19th century, at the École des Beaux-Arts. He was there for 10 years, from 1887 to 1897, and he went back all the time. I think he was in Paris as often as he was in New York. And like many architects who went off to Paris to study, he had to do two things. On the one hand, he went to the school, and by the way, it still looks like that picture on the left. Those gates are there, those portrait busts are there, it hasn't changed. There are no more architects there, now it's all art students. But that's the complex. So there you take classes in windows and elevators and insurance and useful things like that. But then the other half of your education is to be basically apprenticed in the atelier, I guess we would say the studio, of a working French architect. And the architects saw themselves, the French architects, as working in a tradition that went back to the Renaissance. So Whitney Warren went into the atelier of Honoré Domé and Monsieur Giraud. On the right is a student drawing that he did in 1895 for a church in the Azores Island. And you can see it's all very classically inspired. It's Beaux-Arts classicism. And he brought that to New York. So on the left, there is Honoré Domé, one of the two people with whom he studied, with whom he apprenticed in Paris. And there's his Palais de Justice, which is still there in Paris. And on the right, there's Warren's first important building in New York, the Yacht Club. And you can see the influence. It's quite clear. We're working in a classical style. We have got arches, we've got columns, we've got grand Beaux-Arts inspired ornamental patterns. He was bringing what he knew to his city. There's the Petit Palais by Giraud. That's also still there. And here is an early Warren design for Grand Central. And if you look at the arch on the left in the lower image, and then look at the arch in the upper image, you can see where this is coming from. In the end, that's not what we got. We got this. And it's got still triple arches, it's got the large roof, it's got a huge sculptural group. What's changed is that it has this whole complex in the bottom to handle automobile traffic. And I guess horse-drawn traffic too. There would have been horse-drawn traffic still in 1913. That's where the large road coming up from Park Avenue, the Pershing Square Viaduct, then turns into ramps and takes traffic around on either side, because this is New York and we have to let traffic go up Park Avenue. Warren was not happy about that. Reid and Stem insisted on it, that will make it, that's the only way this is going to work. Here it is under construction. You know, we look at grand buildings like this and we imagine that they were built in the traditional fashion, stone piled on stone. Not at all. This is a steel cage structure, just like any skyscraper. But we weren't ready to show that, so it has to look like a large stone building. Also, you know, today when people come to New York, or really any time in the last century, what are the buildings that you go to see? Well, I have to see the Empire State Building. I've got to see the Chrysler Building. Now I'm going to have to go and see, Hudson Yards. But they're all skyscrapers. That's what catches our eye, because they're there. You can't miss them. But before skyscrapers took over, those weren't the important buildings to see. The important buildings to see were buildings like Grand Central, these enormous, larger-than-life buildings, 8 or 10 stories tall, huge classical compositions that dominated their part of town because they were bigger than everything around them. Maybe not taller as the buildings started to go up, but bigger. So the Public Library at 42nd Street, the old Custom House down on Bowling Green, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Natural History, the original Grand Central, the original Penn Station. That's what they were building, a huge monument in New York that was going to be one of the most visible buildings in the city. Here it is completed with the viaduct and the ramps going around, and what you're seeing on the left and the right is what was still there of what was called Terminal City, which actually extended up as far as 50th Street. Remember that the New York Central owned these buildings, therefore they could dictate terms. And essentially, the buildings that surrounded the terminal were either designed by Warren and Wetmore, or if not, Warren and Wetmore had to sign off on them. And the result were buildings that related. They weren't identical, they weren't copies, but they related to the design of Grand Central Terminal. Very little of that survives today. Now, what about the design? Back. The main architectural motif of this facade, those 3 enormous arches, but they're not just any arches. Those are modeled on triumphal arches. There is a triumphal arch, the Roman Arch of Titus from the year 81 in Rome. When Caesar's legions came back from looting the known world, they didn't just sort of stroll back into Rome. They made a big entrance, and they needed something to mark the occasion. And so these arches of triumph were put up so that they could have the great big celebratory entrance into the city. Fast forward to Middle Ages, and later cities now have walls around them. How do you get into a walled city? You go through the gate. And if it's a little dinky gate, you're probably in a small town. But if it's a huge marble gate, you're probably in Rome. So there's one of the city gates of Rome, the Porta San Giovanni from 1574. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, the walls of cities have come down in Europe. How do you enter a big city? How do you enter a city at all? Well, you can walk, you might have a horse, but now you're going to take the train. And the first thing you see isn't going to be the city gate, which tells you where you are. It's going to be the train station. And if the train station is a little siding somewhere, you're in a small town. But it's at a huge cathedral of a building with gigantic steel and glass arches over the train shed and beautiful marble walls. You're in London, you're in Paris, you're in Rome. And Whitney Warren understood this history. He wrote about it. And that is specifically why he chose, look on the right, the form of the Triumphal Arch. Because he said, this is the building that's going to be welcoming New Yorkers, people to New York, and it needs to have that look. And it certainly does. Now, we know that Grand Central is unusual and that it blocks traffic. That turned out to be a handy thing for Warren. Warren knew Paris. Paris is full of vistas, narrow streets that then are closed by a vista of a grand building, and the French take great advantage of this to have vistas like the one you see on the left of the Paris Stock Exchange. Well, you can do that on Park Avenue with Grand Central because it happens to be in the middle of the avenue. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens here. And Warren understood that, and he took advantage of it, and we're looking at Park Avenue we're looking from the south, looking to the facade of the building. So we're standing at about 36th Street. There are different buildings now on either side, but the effect isn't that different. You look up and the vista is closed by this wonderful classical arcade that marks the terminal. And it's one of the very few examples in New York that I can think of where this happens. And again, it's quite deliberate on Warren's part. Now, the terminal looks French. I mean, it looks like somebody picked it up off a street in Paris, flew it across the ocean, dropped it on the corner of Park and 42nd. But it's not modeled on any particular building. But two parts of it are. Two parts of it are modeled on specific things. The Pershing Square Viaduct, which you see on the right, is quite deliberately modeled on a bridge that was quite new in Paris, the Alexander III Bridge, which you see on the left. I was leading a walk of French engineers down 42nd Street, not architectural historians, engineers. And as we approached the bridge, I asked them, does that remind you of anything? And they said, oh, all the bridges in Paris look like that. And from the back came, it's the Alexander III Bridge. It really does look like it. It's a bit simpler. There were going to be some large marble supports, possibly with statues. That was just too expensive. It didn't happen. But it's the same shape. And that's a very specific modeling. All right, as we walk in, you walk in from 42nd Street, it seems like an awfully small entrance for this, where's this grand experience of welcoming us to New York? But that's because it's not meant for us. We're already in New York if we're going into the terminal. The experience is going to be coming into the city. So we walk through here, but we have a chance to see this wonderful inscription. And remember, this was a private company. This was not government. To all those who with head, heart, and hand toiled in the construction of this monument to the public service, this is inscribed. It's a monument to the public service. I think we've forgotten how to think that way about things that aren't from the government, but it is public service. It's also a big money-making operation, obviously. But it's a really important part of New York. You'll notice also that in the center below the wording is the caduceus, right? Now, the stick with the snakes around it, and we tend to think of that as a symbol of medicine, which it is, but it's also a symbol of commerce, not used that way so much anymore. In the 19th century, you'd find it on commercial buildings all the time. Also, it relates to the messenger god, and this is transportation. It's a symbol both of transportation and commerce, which is what Grand Central really is all about. So this is opening day, before the public has been let in. This is the main waiting room, the same one that's there now. The main difference is that the benches have been removed. And that's because those of you who were here in the 70s will remember that when things were falling apart in New York, they were also falling apart in Grand Central, and the waiting room had become a homeless encampment, which was a humanitarian disaster. But it also scared people away from the terminal. So the decision was made when the building was renovated not to use it that way anymore. And the benches, all but a few, were removed. But this is what it looked like when the building opened. And here is the main concourse. It's so funny to see it looking like this one, so empty of people, because this is what we know it as today. And it is just as grand now as it was then. And it's here that one other direct borrowing from France happens. The staircase that you see on the left, those are the stairs that go up to the taxi cab area just off Vanderbilt Avenue. And on your right, the grand stairs at the Paris Opera, the original one, not the Bastille Opera. And they're a little bit different in that at the opera you've got twin staircases coming down and joining into one coming down, whereas at Grand Central you have two starting from the floor going up to one. But it's the same concept, and if you look at the right, there are the grand stairs in Paris, three enormous arched areas, and they're matched by the three enormous arched windows. And that's a clear borrowing. But those are really the only two. That and the Pershing Square Viaduct are the only two that are specific. The rest is just, well, I'm a French-trained architect. Of course it looks French, right? Now the ramps. This was an innovation. Prior stations all use staircases. Now, there are staircases at Grand Central. There are also elevators, but a lot of the circulation comes from ramps. The thinking being that stairs, well, especially if you've got a lot of baggage with you, you can trip and fall down the stairs. It can be a real problem. But we don't have that problem with ramps, and what's more, we've got gravity keeping people moving, right? If you get to an area where you don't have to be moving, like a waiting room or the main concourse, then the floor will be flat. But if you're someplace where you're in motion, you're on your way somewhere, there will be the slope, and that will get people moving. These are the large slopes that go from the upper level to the lower level, and they were very careful about it. They actually did experiments. They put up ramps at different slopes, and they had a very large person try to walk down it, somebody carrying packages, somebody with small children, and they got what they thought was the best slope that would keep people moving, but not actually have them fall over because it was too steep. This is the lower level. Remember, the upper level was for long-distance express trains, the 20th century limited to Chicago, that kind of thing. And the lower level was a completely separate operation with its own ticket windows for commuter trains going up to Westchester and beyond. Now, what about the ornament? Now, Whitney Warren was an American architect who had studied in Paris, like so many other architects of his time. There were plenty of American artists who had also studied in Paris and come back home. And he could have hired some of those, but he didn't. He wanted French. So there are 3 French artists whom he brought in. This is Jules Félix Coutin, who designed the great sculptural group that you see on the front of the building. Until you know what he's doing, that seems like it's sort of a one-off. There are no other statuary groups in New York quite like that. But when you look at this, the eagle hunters at the Natural History Museum in Paris with those enormous eagle wings, or you look on the left there, a mausoleum that he did in Buenos Aires, suddenly you see where the Grand Central Group comes from. Lots of wings, lots of figures. This is just what he did. Now, he never came to New York. He designed it in his studio, and he created the model that you see there on the left, which he then shipped across the ocean. It was then taken out to Long Island City and sculpted. And you can see on the right just how big they are. That's the Hercules model. I mean, it's Hercules on the left, and it's Minerva on the right. Hercules representing the brawn necessary to build the terminal, Minerva the brains necessary to do it. And on top is, and this is my age, I can't think of his name, but that is the messenger god. Help, who is it? Mercury, thank you. Or Hermes, the Greek version. There's Mercury. You'll notice he's got the wings on his cap. He's holding the caduceus, that is his symbol, and he is symbolizing transportation and commerce. It was late. It was a year late. It came in 1914. The terminal opened in 1913. No one was going to rush Monsieur Coutin. But when it was finally up, a reporter went to Paris, found Monsieur Coutin in his studio, and said to him, "Well, Monsieur Coutin, now that you have done this enormous statue and it's finally up in New York, of course you're going to come and visit it to see it, aren't you?" And he said, "I do not think so. From what I have seen of your country, I would find it distressing to come." Some things don't change. So there's Long Island City, and on the right, there's the installation. It was said to be the largest statuary group. I don't think this would include the Statue of Liberty, but the largest statuary group like it anywhere in North America when it went up. Second artist he brought in, Paul César Helleu. Now, Helleu did come to New York. Helleu specialized in doing portraits of young women in society. There is one of his portraits of Consuelo Vanderbilt that he did in 1900. He got a gig to come to New York, find the 12 most beautiful young women in society, and do their portraits. And then those would be taken back to Paris and put on display at a big exhibit somewhere. And meanwhile, they'd also be published in the photogravure section of the New York Times. So that's why he was in New York. While he was here, he met and had lunch with Whitney Warren and talked about what the ceiling should look like. And I don't know if he sketched it out on the back of an envelope or a napkin, but he came up with a general concept of what the ceiling in the main concourse should look like, the zodiac. And then he went back home, and a couple of Americans who had themselves studied in Paris actually executed the work. You gotta love this. A famous French artist seeks America's prettiest girls. I mean, it's just classic. And here's what he did. The Americans who carried it out, J. Monroe Hewlett, Charles Basing, and Charles Gulbranson, worked from the drawings. It's sort of hard to photograph, but you've all seen it, I'm sure. And it shows the figures of the zodiac. And and the stars. 61 of the stars are particularly bright because they're actually electric lights. Hewlett insisted on that. He said it was really important. Remember, electricity was fairly unusual in 1913. This is a way of showing it off. Why the night sky? Well, what the night sky has and the constellations, that's navigation. Now, no train conductor has ever looked at the stars to figure out which way to drive the train, but it's about the overall historical idea of transportation, and that's why it's there. The New York Central was very proud of it. They put out public relations materials saying, if your student is studying the stars and astronomy in school, he can do no better than to come down and stand in our main concourse and look up at this absolutely accurate rendering of the night sky, because we actually had a Columbia professor help our artist to make sure it was right. And that was lovely for a couple of weeks. And then a commuter who was an amateur astronomer looked up at it and said, that's upside down and backwards. And part of it wasn't, so it couldn't be fixed. Now, what you see when you go there is not the original. The original had decayed by 1940. It was beyond help. So Hewlett was brought, now he was a master in his own right, was brought in to repaint it. And somebody asked him, well, now that you're repainting it, you can fix that mistake, right? You'll get the stars in the right place. And he apparently said, you know what? This is not the planetarium. This is decoration. No, I'm not going to change it. And so it stayed on. The third is Sylvan, a sculptor. And he did all of the sculpture that was not the big statuary group on the front of the building. He did all of the decorative work. This is a picture of himself standing in front of, that's the clock area below that enormous statue, and that's his model for it. And it's inscribed to the master, Whitney Warren. He autographed it for him. And it's interesting, Courtauld would not set foot in New York. Hewlett came, did his gig with the pretty girls, and went home. Salier fell in love with America and never left. And here is some of his wonderful work above the windows. Again, the theme is transportation, so there are wheels with enormous wings, which relate a little bit to the wings on Courtauld's statuary group, but it's about transportation generally. There are also an awful lot of acorns. And there's a very simple reason for that. The Vanderbilts had a nice, fancy Dutch name, but they were not an aristocratic family originally. Vanderbilt was a middle-class kid from Staten Island working in his dad's ferry boat service to Manhattan. But from that, he built a shipping empire, hence his nickname, the Commodore. It wasn't about the trains, it was about the boats. And he himself was a very modest person. He never built an enormous, the Vanderbilt mansions, none of them were for him. He wasn't interested in that. But his children and his grandchildren were. And at a certain point, they wanted a coat of arms. And Vanderbilt said, well, look, I've heard that expression, from little acorns, mighty oak trees grow. That's us. We started out as an acorn, and now we're this enormous oak tree. And that became the symbol of the family. And on Vanderbilt buildings in all sorts of places, you will find acorns. And that's why they're there. Eventually, I think it was his great-granddaughter-in-law, who actually then sketched out an actual coat of arms based around the acorns. Now the clock. This is the main clock underneath the statuary group. It's enormous. It's 13 or 14 feet in diameter. I've seen both figures, and I have not been up there to measure it, but it's one or the other. The glass originally was from Tiffany, making this the largest Tiffany timepiece ever created, as far as I know. The number 6 at the bottom, you'll see on the right, it's actually a door. When it's time to service the clock, it opens, and a person can come out. That is how enormous it is. And clocks, of course, are all over the terminal. This is from the inside, looking out in the machinery room. This is a very hard place to get to, but it can be done. Clocks have always been part of Grand Central. On the left, there's the clocks in the towers of the first Grand Central Depot from 1871, and then the replacement 1898 also had them. Why such attention to clocks? Very simple. If I want to catch the 8:02, I don't care what time my watch says it is. I want to know what time Grand Central thinks it is. So clocks are very, very important. There are hundreds of them throughout the complex. This is one of the more famous ones. There are some more. They're everywhere. And they had to be taken care of. And Jacob Bechtold, who was known as Jake the Clockman, was in charge. He would come with his watch, which was set to the correct time as far as he knew, and then he would check each of the clocks and go around these hundreds of clocks and make sure that they were all synchronized to the correct time. Now today it's all done by atomic cesium clock, but once upon a time that was a job. Running the trains, very complex. This wonderful drawing from the Scientific American from 1875, so that's the original Grand Central. The people running the tracks and making the switching happen could actually look out their window at the train yard. With the new complex, there's no way you could do that. So in 1939, there was this electrical gadget with representation on the wall of the different tracks. These were done then in signals towers. They're called towers. I don't know why, because they're flat. They're like this, and they're underground. There are two levels there. The upper level is with the express tracks, and the lower level is, with the commuter tracks, and the lower level is with the, the upper level is the express tracks. The lower level is with the commuter tracks. You're looking at a photograph of the Tower A, which is the one on the upper one, as it once looked. They were destroyed in a fire in the 80s. They're all gone. And but before they did, this was the interlocking machine. I've had this explained to me 3 or 4 times. I do not understand how it works, but apparently, if it's properly done, it's impossible to mess it up in a way that trains run into each other because you didn't get the crossing right. It's a very clever piece of machinery. Now it's, of course, all done inside with computers. But it's the same thing. And I read a newspaper account of a reporter who, back in the days of the interlocking machines, had gone in and was just in awe of the people who were keeping the trains running without bumping into each other. And he didn't want to, somebody turned around to talk to him and said, no, look do what you're doing, it's okay. I was taken through here, and I had the same reaction. Anytime somebody looked away from the screen, I was, no, you don't have to talk to me. It's perfectly fine. It's extraordinarily complex. Obviously, these people are very good at what they do. Now, because the train tracks are underground, they're not just under Park Avenue in the lower section. They actually stretch as far as Lexington Avenue on the east and almost to Madison Avenue on the right. That's the train yard. Therefore, everything built over it, all the buildings going up either side of Park Avenue, they don't have normal foundations. They're sitting on huge steel girders over the tracks. So therefore, they didn't have boilers. Therefore, they didn't have power. They didn't have steam. They didn't have electricity. So New York Central provided it. There was a power station. This is where the Waldorf Astoria is today, that supplied the power, not just to the terminal, not just to the trains, but to all the buildings on either side. Because it was over the tracks, it was very handy. The train cars coming in to offload the coal and take away the ash just pulled up on a siding underneath the power station and did what they had to do. In 1930, the power went underground. Down came the power station, and to be replaced with the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. These are the 1930 new power station. These things still exist. They're 10 stories down. Grand Central has the deepest basement in New York. These are no longer in use, but they're still there, and they're just wonderful to look at. And to get down through these 10 stories, they had to go right down through. They were carved out of bedrock, as you can see from the staircase coming down on the left or on the right. This was a huge, huge effort. So where the power station was, the Waldorf Astoria went up, and that meant that train siding underneath the station was still there. And somebody at the Waldorf Astoria said, this is great. We should advertise. If you're coming on a train down Park Avenue, and if you're one of those people who have their very own private rail cars, you can just detach your rail car and pull up underneath the Waldorf. And you can come into the hotel and avoid the paparazzi. I don't know if they had that expression back then, but that was the idea. Now, it never really caught on. It's only happened a couple of times. There is a story that is really an urban legend that it was built for Franklin Roosevelt, so he could come in and out of New York without being seen in his wheelchair because of his polio. Obviously, that can't be right because it was built for the power station, not for the Waldorf. I tried to track this down. I found one account from an aide to FDR who described it happening once in 1944. FDR died the following year. It happened a couple of other times. That's a picture on the right of Adlai Stevenson, who was running for president around 1952, and he's taken the elevator down to get into the train. And apparently this is now available to presidents. So we're told. It's really hard to know how true this is. No one's talking. But you can't get in yourself. That's not open to the public. It was briefly. A new locomotive was on display, and the public was invited. This is 40, 50 years ago. The public was invited in to see the new trains, and that's one of the few times that it was open to the public. Unless you're Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol managed to have a party. I don't know how he did it. He got permission to have a party there in 1966. It was videotaped, and there are people. I said, there on the lower left-hand corner. There's Mr. Warhol. In the middle, there are two people pretending to have a duel on the train tracks in this area. Just amazing. Now, the Grand Central has been home to many other institutions. It once had a movie theater. Why did it have a movie theater? Well, a couple of executives missed the 5:02 and had to sit around waiting for the 6:02, and apparently one of them said, we need to have some entertainment here while we're waiting for the trains. Let's do a little movie theater. And it got built. It's gone, but it got built. It seated no more than 200 people, and it had clocks and train information in it because people wanted to keep an eye on it. This is one of the very few images that there is, but you'll notice it's got maps in the upper right-hand corner and the lower left-hand corner, and a lot of ornament. That was done by Tony Sarg. His name is sort of not so well known today. He designed, among many other things, the original floats in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Very interesting guy. This became a newsreel theater, and then it closed. You can still see some of the murals. There's a liquor store where the entrance to the theater was, and if you look up, while you're walking through the Gray Bar Passage, watch for the liquor store, look up at the ceiling, and you'll see some stars. That's all that survives from the theater, but it is there. There's a lot of rentable space in the structure. There are 4 towers that you don't really notice in each of the 4 corners of the main concourse, and each one has offices, and they've had different things in them over time. Today it's mostly train-related, but CBS had its first TV studio up there. Why? Because their antenna was on the Chrysler Building, which was just across the street. Walter Cronkite first reported to work for CBS at Grand Central, and for a while the weather was read by Ginger Stanley, who was she did movie work. She was a swimming double for actors. So here she is submerged while the weather is being read. I don't know how long that lasted, but television is an interesting medium, There was an enormous Grand Central Art Gallery. Why would you have an art gallery at a train station? They actually said this. People who are traveling are loose with their money. So you're waiting for your train. I'll go up to the gallery. I love this painting. I'm going to take this home. And it was quite successful for a number of years. It's long gone. There was also an art school with some very prestigious people doing the teaching. And that's, of course, also long gone. Restaurants. There are lots of places to eat today, but the original restaurant, which we now call the Oyster Bar, was the Grand Central Dining Room. And there's a wonderful magazine illustration of the Oyster Bar in the lower left. What you're seeing on the upper right, that is Eleanor Roosevelt. During the Depression years, the Oyster Bar was doubling as a soup kitchen, and she came in to serve soup to the people who were out of work and out of luck and needed something to eat. So, Grand Central was a huge thing when it opened in 1913. Well, it was a huge thing when it opened. The original opened in 1871. It went through some very hard times in the 70s, and as I suspect everyone here knows, there was talk of practically demolishing it and replacing the upper portion with a skyscraper. That did not happen, and then the building was renovated. I think the price is upwards of $350 million now, and it's been brought back to life. And it's now impossible to imagine that anyone would want to remove this building from New York. It is such an important part of the city that it's wonderful that it survives and thrives. My wife's great aunt liked to say that the first 100 years are the hardest. And let's hope that the next century is easier for Grand Central. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer some questions if there are any, but I think because this is being recorded, you have to wait for the microphone to be brought to you. So you pick.
And please make sure to speak directly into the microphone so that we can record it. Thank you.
Professor Whitney Warren Jr. Spoke about his father's central idea for the station, which I've never heard anyone else ever speak of, which was, he said if you look at all the great train stations in the world, all the trains themselves went to the center of the station. And his father's idea was that the center of the station would be the great grand central room. And is that correct? Have you?
I never met his son, so I can't say that that part's correct. In the typical 19th century grand stations in Paris and London and so forth, the train yard is above ground. It's at ground level. Therefore, it's possible to have that enormous steel and glass cathedral-like structure. That's what you see when you get off the train. The Milan train station is a classic example. Because the tracks are underground here in New York, you can't have that of the train yard or the train shed. So instead, you get it in the main concourse. The other aspect of the concourse is how incredibly efficient incredibly efficient it is. If you've been in large train stations elsewhere, you know that you can just try Union Terminal in Washington sometime. You can wander for hours trying to find your way from one part to the other. Going to Grand Central, you come in on 42nd Street, you walk into the little vestibule there, you walk down the stairs, you're in the main waiting room, or what used to be the main waiting room. You walk a little bit further, you're in the main concourse, there's the information booth. Behind you are the ticket booths. Then you walk to the other side of the main concourse, and there are the entrance to the tracks. You can get from 42nd Street to the track in 3 minutes. 5 or 6 if you have to buy a ticket and get some information. That's extraordinary, so I imagine that must be what he had in mind.
The other question I have, his father was kicked out of the AIA, I think, for 10 years, but Whitney never spoke about that. Do you know what his crime was in the eyes of the AIA?
Whitney never spoke about that. I have no idea. He's not the only one. Ralph Walker, I think, was kicked out of the AIA too at one time. Who knows what they were up to? But I don't know. Another question?
I should know this, but did Warren and Wetmore compete to build Grand Central?
No, they did not compete. That was the whole point. That's why Reid and Stem were so shocked. They weren't even in the competition. It was McKim, Mead, and White. It was Daniel Burnham. It was Mr. Huckle, and it was Reid and Stem. That was it. But the competition was different. It was competing with Penn Station. I've got to get somebody in there to work with these guys so that it'll be beautiful. And you know, if you're writing the checks, you can do whatever you want, apparently. So that's what happened.
East Side Access, you talked about air rights with things going up. East Side Access probably the most significant thing going down in the last 25 years, let's say this millennium. Any thoughts? Have you done a tour? Any insights into how that might change Grand Central?
For those who don't know, East Side Access refers to a plan to have a spur of the Long Island Railroad come into Manhattan. Long Island Railroad goes to Penn Station. If you have to get to Midtown from Penn Station, you've got to go up on the 1 to 42nd Street and then catch the shuttle. What a pain in the neck. So several $1 billion are being spent to have a spur of the Long Island Railroad come in at 42nd Street and underneath Grand Central. It's several years and many dollars over budget. I don't think it's complete yet. I got a tour of it back in 2013 when I was working on this project. It's really far underground. The basement where the power station was already the deepest basement in New York, and this is further down. It'll be extraordinary, I'm sure, once it's finished. But I like to imagine that in the future, when archaeology in New York is going to be underwater archaeology, that whoever the archaeologists are going to be digging underneath Grand Central, and they're going to say, wait a minute, I think we found the original one underneath it. Just a guess.
Following on with that question, it's my understanding that Grand Central has excess capacity. And there's some of the tracks over in the 20s that are not being used for regular service. And a lot of people think it was totally unnecessary to build a deep cavern station costing a huge amount of money when there was a way to bring the trains from the Long Island Railroad into the present Grand Central Terminal, either the upper or the lower levels.
I just don't know enough about it to say, but sounds plausible to me.
Last question.
I've heard stories that Warren and Wetmore had a reputation for stealing work from other architects, and that had something to do with their getting kicked out of the AIA. Do you know anything about that?
I'm sorry, I really don't. I did, back in the around 1980, I interviewed a couple of architects who'd worked in, they're long gone now, who had been working in the 20s and 30s and doing Art Deco apartment houses on the Concourse, and one of them said that he'd gone down and found another architect pulling his own drawings and copying them. And he went over to that architect and said, you could just come to my office, I'd be happy to give it to you. So apparently this is something that does happen from time to time. I would hope it would get you kicked out of the AIA, but that's something I don't know enough about it to say. If that's the last question, thank you so much.
Thank you. Could I just ask for your attention for a moment? First of all, Tony, that was just fantastic. And I was just thinking, this is one of the landmarks in New York City that we all have an intimate acquaintanceship with. But yet, I think I'd speak for all of us that you revealed so many factors and facets that we had no idea. And it really was a wonderful, entertaining lecture. And thank you so much for delivering it. We are so grateful.
Thank you so much.
No.
I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Tony. Thank you very much.
Good heavens.
And we want to mark this occasion, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dengel.
Thank you, Karen. And I just want to say, Tony, I also love that you brought up that inscription about the building trades. And I'm curious, it's almost a partly scripture for me. As I enter that building, I always stop and read that, and I better do that as the executive director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen and the daughter of a local 14 operating engineer. But thank you for saying that, and thank you for bringing so much to our attention about that building. And once again, as I listened to your lecture, I thought about how fortunate we are for all the people of the building trades that build the places that we live in, the cars that we drive. They touch every aspect of our lives, whether it's plumbing or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. We can't live without them. And the fact that you stopped and said something, that means a lot. So thank you. And on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Anthony W. Robbins, historian and writer, for his lecture, Grand Central Terminal, 100 Years of a New York Landmark, for his participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. So thank you, Tony.
Thank you so much.
And because you've really grown on us in this hour, we have also made you a lifetime member of our library. So thank you.
Okay, and finally, a little memento of tonight, thank you, and a General Society by the hammer in hand, all arts to stand bag to leave with.
Oh,
okay.
the tote bag.
Yeah, the tote bag.